In the silence of the night, a tormented priest teeters on the edge of a bridge ready to end his pain. But before he jumps, a stranger millionaire grabs him and stops him. What seemed like a heroic act quickly turns into an unexpected encounter between two broken men. And in that conversation on the brink of the abyss, both discover that redemption can come from where they least expect it. If this story interests you, subscribe to our channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing, night fell over Chicago like a heavy shroud. Lights dotted the metropolis in an endless ballet, reflecting on the Chicago River like liquid stars. On the cable-stayed bridge, a symbol of the city's modernity, Father Thomas Miller, 48, walked slowly. His hesitant steps contradicted the determination in his gaze. He wore his black cassock, worn by time, just as his soul seemed to be. The E. Sky poured a fine drizzle, typical of Chicago, which mingled with the silent tears that ran down his face, marked by premature wrinkles. Thomas had dedicated 25 years of his life to the church, comforting the faithful, hearing confessions, guiding lost youth. Ironic how now he himself was more lost than anyone who had ever sought his help. He stopped exactly in the middle of the bridge. His fingers caressed the rosary in his pocket, a gift from his late mother when he entered the seminary. "Forgive me, Mother. Forgive me, Lord," he whispered as he approached the edge. The void below seemed to call him, promising relief from the guilt he had carried for 7 years. It was then that the black Range Rover of Augustus Walker, 52, suddenly slowed down. The businessman, owner of one of the largest construction companies in the country, was returning from a business meeting when he spotted the silhouette of the priest dangerously leaning over the bridge's guardrail. Something in the man's gesture made him stop. It wasn't common for Augustus to get involved in other people's affairs. The business world had taught him to keep his distance from others' suffering, but there was something about that scene that touched him deeply. "Sir, wait!" shouted Augustus, hurriedly getting out of the car, ignoring the rain that was now falling more heavily. His $10,000 Italian suit was immediately soaked. Thomas turned slightly, surprised by the interruption. His eyes, red and swollen, met Augustus's. There was a silent plea in them, although Augustus didn't know if it was a plea to leave him alone or to save him. "Please, step back." "It's not worth it," Augustus continued, cautiously approaching, like someone approaching a wounded animal. "You don't understand," Thomas replied, his voice almost inaudible under the noise of cars and rain. "Some stains can't be washed away. Some sins can't be forgiven." Thomas's determination disturbed Augustus. He himself knew well the weight of carrying secrets and remorse. His fortune had been built on questionable decisions, dubious alliances, and moments of moral weakness. However, unlike the priest, Augustus had learned to live with his demons, lulling them to sleep with luxury and power. "Everyone deserves a second chance," argued Augustus, now just a few meters from the priest. "Whatever is tormenting you, it can't be greater than the possibility of redemption." Thomas gave a bitter laugh. "Redemption? When you destroy something as precious as I destroyed, there's no possible redemption." At that moment, a car passed at high speed, spraying water over both of them. The vibration made Thomas momentarily lose his balance. Augustus, in a quick movement, grabbed the priest's arm, pulling him away from the edge. The two men fell on the wet floor of the bridge, panting. "Let me go," shouted Thomas, struggling. "Why can't you just let me go?" Augustus maintained a firm grip, even as the priest tried to break free. "Because today I was destined to pass over this bridge at this exact moment. Call it coincidence, destiny, or divine work, Father, but I won't let you give up." Something in Augustus's conviction made Thomas stop fighting. Exhausted, the priest allowed himself to stay on the wet ground, his body shaken by deep sobs. "Let's get out of this rain," suggested Augustus, helping Thomas to his feet. "My apartment is 10 minutes from here. We can talk there, or I can take you wherever you want." "I have nowhere to go," confessed Thomas. "I left the parish. I left everything." Augustus's penthouse apartment in Lincoln Park contrasted brutally with the simplicity Thomas was accustomed to. Original works of art, designer furniture, a panoramic view of the city that now lit up under the night. Augustus offered the priest dry clothes and a hot drink, which Thomas accepted mechanically, as if in a trance. Seated in the huge living room, with the city pulsing below them, the two men remained silent for a few minutes. Augustus observed the priest, whose hunched posture and distant gaze betrayed a completely broken man. "My name is Augustus Walker," he finally introduced himself. "I build bridges and buildings, among other things." "Father Thomas Miller," replied the other with a weak voice. "Or just Thomas now, I suppose. I no longer deserve the title." "What happened to lead you to that bridge today, Thomas?" The priest raised his eyes, studying Augustus's face. He saw in it not just curiosity, but something that seemed like genuine concern. Even so, he hesitated. "Why do you care? We're complete strangers." Augustus poured himself a drink and reflected before answering. "Maybe because seeing you on that bridge, something in me recognized itself in you. The difference is that you still have the courage to feel guilt. I learned to bury it under layers of indifference." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding. 7 years ago, he began, I was a parish priest in a small community in rural Indiana, a simple town, people of faith. I had under my responsibility a social project for children in vulnerable situations. His voice faltered, and he took a sip of the tea Augustus had prepared before continuing. "Among these children, there was a girl named Mary Claire, 12 years old, intelligent, determined. Her mother worked as a domestic worker, and her father had left years ago. Mary Claire dreamed of being a doctor." Thomas's hands began to shake. One day, one of the project volunteers, a man respected in the community, began to show an inappropriate interest in Mary Claire. "I noticed the signs, noticed the behavior, but—" "You did nothing," completed Augustus, understanding. "Worse," corrected Thomas, self-hatred evident in his voice. "When Mary Claire finally gathered the courage to tell me what was happening, I didn't believe her. The man was a member of the church council, contributed generously, came from a traditional family, and she was just a poor child with a fertile imagination, I thought." Thomas covered his face with his hands. 2 weeks later, Mary Claire, she couldn't take it anymore. She took her own life. She left a letter detailing everything she had suffered. And I, who should have protected her, who should have been her voice when she had no strength to scream, I abandoned her. The silence that followed was almost palpable. Outside, Chicago continued its frantic rhythm, oblivious to the drama unfolding in that luxurious penthouse. "What happened after?" asked Augustus, his voice softer now. "The truth came out. The man was arrested, but that didn't bring Mary Claire back. The community was divided. Some blamed me, others defended me. The church transferred me to Chicago, to a parish in the center. I continued my work, trying to atone for my sin, helping other vulnerable children. But the guilt never diminished." "And what changed today? Why did you decide it? Was time to jump off that bridge?" Thomas abruptly stood up, walking to the window. The city shone below, indifferent. "Today I received a letter. Mary Claire's mother, she finally left this world. Her last wish was for me to know that she never forgave me, that I should live with this knowledge for the rest of my days." Augustus approached, stopping beside the priest. "And now?" he asked softly. "Now," replied Thomas, "I no longer know who I am or why I continue here. I've lost my faith, lost my purpose. I'm just an empty shell that breathes and moves by inertia." Augustus put a hand on the priest's shoulder. "Maybe I can help you discover." Thomas turned to face him, a spark of something, perhaps hope, perhaps just curiosity, shining in his eyes for the first time. "Why? Why would you care?" An enigmatic smile appeared on Augustus's lips. "Let's say that saving a priest might be a good start for my own redemption." Outside, the rain had finally ceased, and the first stars began to appear in the Chicago sky. The first rays of the morning sun filtered through the huge windows of the penthouse, creating golden patterns on the Italian marble floor. Thomas woke up disoriented, momentarily confused about where he was. The guest room where Augustus had accommodated him was larger than his entire former room in the parish. Slowly, the memories of the previous night flooded his mind. The bridge, the rain, the despair, and the stranger who prevented him from committing what his faith considered the ultimate sin. Thomas sat on the bed, running his hands over his tired face. Part of him still wished for oblivion, the end of all suffering. But something had changed. A tiny spark, almost imperceptible, of curiosity about why this rich and powerful man had decided to intervene in his fate. After a long shower, Thomas found clean clothes carefully folded on an armchair. Jeans, white shirt, grey sweater, civilian clothes, not ecclesiastical. He hesitated for a moment before dressing. Abandoning the cassock, even temporarily, seemed like a symbolic act of separation from the identity that had defined his existence for so many years. In the spacious dining room, Augustus was already having breakfast, surrounded by newspapers and a tablet where he checked market quotations. Seeing Thomas, he smiled and indicated the chair in front of him. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, while the housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, a middle-aged Hispanic lady, served fresh coffee to the guest. "Better than I expected," Thomas replied honestly. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Walker. I don't intend to abuse it. As soon as I finish my coffee, I'll be on my way." Augustus lowered the tablet, staring at the priest intently. "And where exactly do you intend to go?" The question hung in the air, exposing the cruel reality. Thomas had no plan, no place, no purpose. "I haven't decided yet." "Then stay," Augustus proposed simply. "I have plenty of space, as you can see. And I believe our meeting wasn't accidental." Thomas frowned, intrigued. "Are you a religious man, Mr. Walker?" A brief laugh escaped Augustus's lips. "Far from it. Let's say I'm a pragmatist with occasional flashes of superstition. And please, call me Augustus. Mr. makes me feel even older than I am." A comfortable silence settled as they both ate. Thomas discreetly observed his host. Augustus Walker emanated an aura of power and control, but there was something more. A restlessness, perhaps, or a well-disguised melancholy that the priest, accustomed to reading human souls in the confessional, could perceive. "Why build bridges?" Thomas suddenly asked. Augustus raised his eyebrows, surprised by the question. "It's a lucrative business," he answered automatically. "No," insisted Thomas. "Why did you, personally, choose to build bridges and not, say, shopping malls or condominiums?" An enigmatic smile appeared on Augustus's face. "Perceptive, Father. Bridges, they connect what's separated. They transform the impossible into possible. When I was a child, I lived in a peripheral neighborhood. To get to school, I had to go around a stream, adding almost an hour to the journey. I dreamed of a bridge there, simple as that." Thomas nodded, understanding that he had touched on something deep. "And you? What will you do today?" asked Augustus, changing the subject. "I don't know. I didn't plan to live beyond last night." "Then allow me to suggest something. Today I have meetings until late, but tomorrow we can start working on your problem." "My problem?" "Finding your purpose again, rebuilding your faith if that's what you want, or building something completely new." Thomas felt an unexpected wave of emotion. It had been so long since anyone truly cared about his well-being. "Why do you care, Augustus? What do you gain by helping a broken and suicidal priest?" Augustus stood up, adjusting his impeccable suit. "Maybe I'm just trying to accumulate points with the man upstairs just in case." But his joking tone didn't convince Thomas. There was something more, a hidden motivation that intrigued him. "Make yourself at home," Augustus continued. "Mrs. Rodriguez will be here if you need anything. There are books in the library, movies, a pool on the terrace. Consider yourself on a forced retreat." After Augustus left, Thomas explored the luxurious apartment. In the library, he found everything from literary classics to treatises on philosophy and economics. To his surprise, there was also a considerable section on theology, including rare works that he knew only by references. Among the books, one in particular caught his attention, an unauthorized biography of Edward Fontaine, founder of the Fontaine Foundation, one of the largest religious philanthropic institutions in the country. The book seemed to have been read and reread, with handwritten notes in the margins, the elegant handwriting that Thomas presumed to be Augustus's. The name Fontaine awakened uncomfortable memories in Thomas. The foundation had funded many church projects, including the shelter for children in Indiana, where Mary Claire had been. In fact, the man who had abused her was Edward Fontaine's nephew and the foundation's representative in the small town. Curious, Thomas began to read the book. Contrary to the public image of a Christian benefactor, the author painted Edward Fontaine as a calculating man who used philanthropy as a facade for political and business interests. But what intrigued Thomas most were Augustus's notes, which seemed to reveal an intimate knowledge and an almost personal obsession with Fontaine. The hours passed as Thomas delved into the reading. Upon reaching a chapter about the origins of the Fontaine fortune, he found a particularly vehement note. "He destroyed my father to build his empire. The truth needs to be revealed." Intrigued, Thomas closed the book when he heard the sound of the private elevator announcing Augustus's return. He quickly replaced the volume on the shelf and headed to the living room. Augustus returned accompanied by a woman with a striking presence, Helen Norton, 45, corporate lawyer for Walker Construction. Tall, with black hair cut in a precise bob. Keen eyes behind thin-framed glasses, she exuded competence and authority. "Thomas, this is Helen, my right hand and advisor for the past 15 years, Augustus introduced. "Helen, this is Father, Thomas Miller." "Ex-priest," Thomas corrected automatically, extending his hand. Helen evaluated him with a professional look before accepting the greeting. Augustus mentioned he was hosting a friend, but omitted the details. "Nice to meet you, Thomas." The three had dinner together, a meal prepared by a private chef that Augustus had called especially for the occasion. The conversation flowed easily, with Helen and Augustus discussing ongoing projects and business challenges, occasionally including Thomas with contextual explanations. Thomas observed the dynamics between the two with interest. It was evident that they shared more than a professional relationship, although it was difficult to define exactly the nature of that bond. It didn't seem romantic, but there was an intimacy and mutual trust that only years could build. "So, Thomas," Helen said as they savored dessert, "how did you meet Augustus? He rarely brings friends home." Before Thomas could elaborate an answer, Augustus intervened. "We met under unusual circumstances. Thomas is in a moment of transition and needs a space to reorganize his thoughts." The look Helen gave Augustus made it clear that she wasn't satisfied with the vague explanation, but she didn't insist. "And what brought you to this moment of transition?" she asked, turning to Thomas. Thomas hesitated. The truth was too complex, too painful to share. "With a stranger, I lost my faith," he answered simply. "Not just in God, but in myself." Helen nodded, understanding. "I know that feeling well, albeit in different contexts. Sometimes you need to unlearn who you were to discover who you can be." The unexpectedly profound observation created a momentary connection between them. Thomas realized that there was more to Helen than the professional facade revealed. Later, when Helen said goodbye, Thomas noticed the way Augustus accompanied her to the elevator, his hands lightly touching her back in a protective gesture. There was a moment of private conversation between them, with occasional glances in his direction, before the doors closed. Back in the living room, Augustus poured himself a whiskey before turning to Thomas. "Helen is more than my lawyer. She's my oldest friend and the person I trust most in this world." "You seem close," Thomas commented. "We met under complicated circumstances. She helped me at a time when I could have lost everything." Thomas nodded, feeling there was much more to this story. "Augustus," he began hesitantly, "while you were out, I spent some time in the library. Did you find anything interesting?" "Actually, yes, a book about Edward Fontaine." Augustus's expression visibly hardened, a subtle but undeniable transformation. "And what did you think of the reading?" he asked, his voice controlled. "Revealing. Especially your notes." Augustus studied Thomas for a long moment before answering. "So you discovered my little research project. Why so much interest in Fontaine?" Augustus walked to the window, contemplating the night city before responding. My father was an engineer, a brilliant man who developed a revolutionary method for bridge construction. Edward Fontaine, at T, the time an emerging entrepreneur, proposed a partnership. My father trusted him, shared his projects, his knowledge. 6 months later, Fontaine patented the method as his own, using legal loopholes and political influence. My father tried to fight, but he was a simple man against an empire in formation. What happened to your father? He couldn't bear the betrayal, the injustice. He fell ill. I became an engineer like him, built my company from scratch, swore that one day the truth would come out. Thomas approached, feeling the weight of Augustus's confession. Is that why you helped me? Because somehow it connects me to Fontaine through that project in Indiana? Augustus turned, facing Thomas directly. At first, yes. When I recognized you on the bridge, I remembered the scandal involving Fontaine's nephew in that small town. I thought you might have useful information. But when I heard your story, I realized we were more alike than I had imagined. We both carry guilt that others don't understand. We both seek redemption. A heavy silence settled between them. What do you want from me exactly? Thomas finally asked. At first, I wanted to use you as a piece in my game against Fontaine. Now, honestly, I don't know. Maybe we can help each other in ways we don't yet understand. Augustus's raw honesty surprised Thomas. It wasn't what he expected from a powerful businessman. And if I don't want to be part of this and revenge, you're free to go at any time. But before you decide, there's something I need to show you tomorrow. Something that might change your perspective on everything you believe you know. That night, lying in the luxurious bed of the guest room, Thomas reflected on the twists his life had taken in. Just 24 hours. From a man about to give up everything to a piece in a game bigger than he barely understood. For the first time in years, the weight of guilt for Mary Claire seemed momentarily suspended, replaced by a disturbing curiosity about what Augustus wanted to show him. Thomas fell asleep with a question echoing in his mind. Was it possible that his greatest failure was connected to something much bigger than he had ever imagined? The following morning brought a sky of an almost painful blue, contrasting with the heavy atmosphere that hung between Thomas and Augustus during breakfast. Both ate in silence, immersed in their own thoughts, until Augustus finally spoke. Today we're going on a trip. Prepare to spend the day out. Where are we going? Thomas questioned, noticing the grave expression on his host's face. Back to the beginning, we're going to clear waters. The name of the small Indiana town where everything had happened hit Thomas like a physical blow. He felt the air escape from his lungs, the cup trembling in his hand. I can't go back there, he protested, his voice choked with emotion. I don't have that right. This isn't about rights, Thomas, it's about truth, and I believe you deserve to know it completely before giving up on your life. Augustus's private helicopter landed on the outskirts of Clear Waters shortly before noon. The town of 30,000 inhabitants seemed frozen in time, with its central square dominated by a century-old main church and colonial mansions that witnessed a more prosperous past. Thomas kept his gaze down as they walked along the cobblestone streets. He felt as if each window harbored accusing eyes, as if each whisper from the residents was about him, the priest who failed to protect a child. Relax, Augustus murmured, noticing his tension. No one will recognize you. 7 years change. A person. Indeed, Thomas had changed. The once vigorous and confident man had given way to a thinner figure, with prematurely gray hair and a posture bent by the invisible weight of guilt. They stopped in front of a modest house on the outskirts of town. A simple construction, with walls yellowed by time and a small garden where rose bushes struggled against the rocky soil. What place is this? Thomas asked, confused. The house where Mary Claire lived with her mother. Thomas shuddered instinctively, taking a step back. Why did you bring me here? To reopen wounds, to intensify my guilt? Augustus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he approached the door and knocked 3 times. After a few moments, a woman of about 40 answered, brown hair with gray streaks framed a face of simple beauty, marked by deep lines that spoke of suffering and resilience. "Mr. Walker," she greeted with a slight smile. "I wasn't expecting you so early." "Anna, this is—" Augustus hesitated, looking at Thomas. "Thomas," he completed, unable to disguise the tremor in his voice. Anna's gaze lingered on him for a long moment, studying him intently. A flash of recognition appeared in her eyes, but was quickly replaced by a neutral expression. "Come in, please." The simple living room was impeccably clean. Framed photographs decorated the walls, many of them showing a bright-eyed girl with a wide smile, Mary Claire at different ages. Thomas felt his legs weaken. Instinctively, he sought support on the nearest wall, fighting against the wave of nausea that overcame him. "Sit down," Anna offered, indicating the worn sofa covered by a colorful handmade quilt. "Forgive me," Thomas murmured, his voice barely audible. "I shouldn't be here." Anna looked at him with an indecipherable expression before sitting in the opposite armchair. "Your father Thomas, aren't you?" The question hung in the air like a sentence. Thomas felt the world spin around him. There was no escape, nowhere to hide. "Yes," he confessed, his eyes fixed on the floor. "It's me." He expected screams, accusations, maybe even violence. But what came next caught him completely off guard. "I knew we would meet again someday," Anna said, her voice calm, almost resigned. "You look different, but the eyes are the same." "Anna," Augustus intervened, "could you tell us what you discovered after what happened to Mary Claire?" Thomas shot a confused look at Augustus. "Discovered? What was there to discover?" The story was painfully simple. His negligence, his disbelief, the tragedy that followed. Anna stood up and went to an old piece of furniture in the corner of the room. From a drawer, she pulled out a folder worn from frequent handling. "After I lost my daughter," she began, her voice firm despite the painful topic, "something in me died with her. But another part awakened, a part that refused to accept the official version of the facts." She opened the folder, revealing newspaper clippings, notes, photographs, various documents. Richard Fontaine, the man who hurt my daughter, wasn't just the nephew of the great philanthropist Edward Fontaine. He was his right-hand man in an operation much larger than a simple social project in a small town. Thomas listened, astonished, as Anna unfolded a theory that seemed straight. Out of a conspiracy thriller, the Fontaine Foundation used its social projects as a facade for questionable operations, from money laundering to influence peddling. "But what does this have to do with Mary Claire?" Thomas asked, confused. "My daughter was extremely observant and intelligent," Anna explained, a brief smile of pride appearing on her lips as she remembered her daughter. She began to notice strange patterns, donations that appeared in the books but not in reality. Volunteers who showed up only to take photos and then disappeared. One day she found documents in the foundation's office when she was helping organize files. What kind of documents? Records of transfers to overseas. Accounts, lists of politicians and their contributions. She didn't fully understand what she was seeing, but she knew it was wrong. That's when Richard Fontaine started getting close to her. The revelation hit Thomas like lightning. "You're saying that the abuse was a form of control, of intimidation," Augustus completed, who had been following the narrative with a somber expression. "And when she finally gathered the courage to tell you, Father, she wasn't just revealing the abuse, she was trying to expose something much bigger." "But I didn't believe her," Thomas murmured, the understanding of the magnitude of his failure now even more crushing. "And she had no one else to turn to," Anna said, silent tears now running down her tired face. "When I found my daughter, there was a notebook next to her, a diary where she documented everything she had discovered about the foundation." "What happened to that diary?" Thomas asked, a sudden urgency in his voice. "It disappeared," Anna replied. "When the police came, it was no longer there. Neither were the documents she had mentioned hiding." "That's when you started your investigation?" Augustus asked. Anna nodded. "At first, no one believed me. I was just a mother driven mad by grief, inventing conspiracies to make sense of a senseless tragedy. But then 2 years ago, Mr. Walker found me. Thomas turned to Augustus, perplexed. You knew all this? Is that why you brought me here? Not exactly, Augustus replied. I was investigating Edward Fontaine for personal reasons, as I told you. During my investigations, I discovered Mary Claire's case and Anna's suspicions. When you appeared on the bridge that night, it was as if the pieces of the puzzle started to fit together. The letter I received, Thomas began, a terrible suspicion forming in his mind. Never existed, Augustus confirmed. I sent it. I needed to find you, talk to you, but you had disappeared. No one in the diocese knew your whereabouts. The revelation should have infuriated Thomas, the manipulation, the lie that had driven him to the brink of despair. But strangely, he felt only an immense tiredness. Why now? He asked Augustus. Why look for me after so long? Because we finally have a chance to expose Edward Fontaine and his entire organization, Augustus replied, a feverish intensity in his gaze. 3 months ago, a former Foundation employee contacted us with information that corroborates everything Anna suspected. We have proof, Thomas, concrete proof, but we need you. Me? What could I possibly offer? Your testimony, your credibility. As a former priest, you can be the voice that Mary Claire never had. Thomas closed his eyes, trying to process everything he had just heard. The guilt he had carried for 7 years now transformed into something even more complex. He hadn't just failed to protect a child, he had inadvertently become part of a much larger cover-up. The Fontaine Foundation continues to operate, Augustus continued. Other projects, other vulnerable children. The pattern repeats itself. And the church? Thomas asked, his voice almost a whisper. What does it know about this? An uncomfortable silence filled the room. It was Anna who finally answered. Some members of the hierarchy suspect, others prefer not to see. The Foundation is one of the largest donors to the diocese. Questioning its integrity would risk losing millions in funding for social works. Thomas felt a wave of nausea again. The institution to which he had dedicated his life, the faith that had sustained his being, everything seemed tainted now. I need time, he finally said, standing up. This is quite too much to absorb at once. He went out to the small garden, seeking air. The rose bushes he had noticed before now seemed significant to him, beauty resisting in the midst of adversity. He sat on a rustic bench, trying to organize his thoughts. Minutes later, he felt someone's presence beside him. It was Anna offering him a glass of water. I know it's a lot to process, she said softly. How can you be so calm with me? Thomas asked, genuinely confused. I failed your daughter. I didn't believe her when she needed me most. Anna contemplated the rose bushes for a moment before answering. I spent years hating you, Father, blaming you, but then I realized that you were a victim too. Not in the same way as my Clara, certainly, but you were manipulated, used as part of the system that silenced her. That doesn't absolve me. No, it doesn't absolve you, but it offers a chance for redemption, a chance to do what you didn't do 7 years ago. Listen to my daughter and act based on what she was trying to say. Thomas stared at Anna, seeing in her a strength he couldn't comprehend. How did you survive all this? How did you find the strength to continue? A sad smile appeared on her lips. At first, it was for Clara's memory, then for justice. And now it's so that other mothers don't have to go through what I went through. Inside the house, Augustus was patiently waiting, leafing through the documents Anna had collected. When Thomas and Anna returned, he looked up, expectant. What exactly do you need from me? Thomas asked, a new determination in his voice. Your testimony, your help in connecting the dots, and mainly, your courage to face both the Foundation and the Church if necessary. Thomas took a deep breath. I don't know. If I have that courage. You do, Anna affirmed with conviction. You just don't know it yet. When they left Anna's house, the sun was already setting, painting the clear water's sky in shades of orange and red. On the way back to the helicopter, they passed through the central square where the main church stood, imposing. Thomas stopped, contemplating the building where he had presided over masses, heard confessions, guided the faithful. It seemed to belong to another life, another time. "Do you want to go in?" Augustus asked, noticing his hesitation. "No," Thomas replied after a moment. "I'm not ready yet." In the helicopter, as they flew over the Indiana landscape that gradually gave way to the lights of Chicago, Thomas remained silent, absorbing everything he had discovered. "What are you thinking about?" Augustus eventually asked. "About how the truth is rarely what it seems at first glance," Thomas replied, "and about how our actions or omissions can have repercussions we never imagined." Augustus studied the ex-priest's profile against the night sky. "So are you with us in this fight?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried a conviction that surprised them both. "I am. Not for revenge or personal redemption, but because it's what Mary Claire deserved from me 7 years ago. It's the least I can do for her now." Augustus's private office occupied an entire floor of a commercial building on Michigan Avenue, the East financial heart of Chicago. Unlike the luxurious penthouse where he lived, his workspace was surprisingly austere, functional and elegant, but without unnecessary ostentation. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the city, while the interior housed only the essentials: an imposing dark wood desk, some ergonomic chairs, and an entire wall covered with screens displaying graphs, news, and real-time data. It was a Thursday morning, 3 days after the trip to clear waters, and Thomas was sitting in a meeting room adjacent to the main office, accompanied by Helen and a man he had just met. Ryan Matthews, 35, a former financial analyst for the Fontaine Foundation, now a collaborator in Augustus's investigations. "The structure is complex, but the principle is simple," Ryan explained, manipulating images on a tablet that projected onto the wall screen. "The foundation operates more than 50 social projects throughout the United States, most in remote or peripheral areas, where oversight is precarious or non-existent." The scheme Ryan outlined was impressive in its perverse ingenuity. The Fontaine Foundation received millionaire donations, both from companies and individuals, all tax-deductible. Officially, these values were destined for specific social projects: orphanages, schools, community centers, professional training projects. In practice, only a fraction of these resources reached the announced destination. The rest, Ryan continued, is diverted through a network of shell companies and partner NGOs until it reaches overseas accounts or is used to buy political influence. "How did no one notice this before?" Thomas questioned, genuinely perplexed. Helen, who had been observing silently until then, intervened. "The Fontaine Foundation is extremely skilled at building an impeccable public image. Edward Fontaine is seen as a benefactor, an exemplary philanthropist. The number of politicians, celebrities, and religious figures who endorse his work creates an almost impenetrable shield." "Moreover," Ryan added, "who would dare question an institution that, despite everything, still does some good? The projects exist, people are helped, just not on the scale or with the efficiency they announce." Augustus entered the room, bringing with him a folder full of documents and a grave expression. "I received news from our contacts," he announced without preamble. "The foundation is organizing a major charity event next Saturday, a fundraising gala for a new project, a shelter for homeless children, in New York City." "A perfect opportunity," Helen commented, a calculating gleam in her eye. "All the main supporters will be present, including church figures." "Precisely," Augustus agreed, turning to Thomas. "Which brings us to your role in this operation." Thomas felt a chill down his spine. In the past few days, he had immersed himself in the investigations, helping to establish connections between the documents gathered by Anna and the information provided by Ryan. But until now, he hadn't considered what his active involvement would be in the direct confrontation with the Fontaine Foundation. "What exactly do you expect me to do?" he asked cautiously. "We need you to attend the gala," Augustus replied, "as my personal guest. Your presence there as a former priest linked to the Clear Waters case will send a powerful message to Edward Fontaine. It's time to show that we know what he did and what he continues to do." "It's a deliberate provocation," Thomas observed. "It's a test," Helen corrected. We want to see how he reacts when he sees you. If he has something to hide, and I know he does, this could pressure him into making a mistake. The idea of facing Edward Fontaine at a public event, surrounded by his allies, made Thomas hesitate. He had spent years hiding from his own past, avoiding confrontations, seeking anonymity as a form of penance. Now he was being called to do exactly the opposite, expose himself, become visible, provoke a reaction. "I'm not sure if I have the strength for this," he confessed. Augustus approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You survived 7 years, carrying a guilt that we now know wasn't entirely yours. You found strength to continue, even when you believed you had failed in the worst possible way. That's the strength we need now." Thomas looked at the 3 faces watching him expectantly. In the past few days, they had become his new reality, his unlikely family of circumstance. Helen, with her calculated efficiency and fierce loyalty, to Augustus. Ryan, whose courage in denouncing his former employer had put his own safety at risk, and Augustus, whose motivations remained partially obscure, but whose determination was undeniable. "What if he recognizes me? If he knows who I am?" Thomas asked. "We're counting on that," Helen replied. "In fact, it would be disappointing if he didn't recognize you. And what prevents Edward Fontaine from simply ignoring me, or worse, ordering me removed from the event? Because," Augustus explained with a slight smile, "you'll be with me. And as powerful as Edward is, he can't afford to publicly offend one of the biggest potential donors for his new project." The final piece of the puzzle clicked in Thomas's mind. "You're going to pretend interest in funding his project." "Exactly. I've been cultivating this approach for months through intermediaries. Edward believes I'm considering a substantial donation for his shelter. My presence at the gala is eagerly anticipated." The night before the event, Thomas couldn't sleep. From the balcony of Augustus's penthouse, he observed the city that never really rests, its lights blinking like earthly stars. Chicago, with its frenzied rhythm and brutal contrasts, seemed the perfect setting for the drama that was about to unfold. "I thought I'd find you here," said a familiar voice behind Thomas. Helen approached, stopping beside him to contemplate the view. The past few months had softened some of the lines of tension in her face, although she still carried the intensity that characterized her. "How was the meeting with the Patent Commission?" Thomas asked. A genuine smile illuminated Augustus's face. "They officially recognized my father as the creator of the construction method. His name will be restored in all historical records and technical manuals." "He would be proud," Thomas commented. "Maybe," Augustus replied. "More importantly, he can finally rest in peace." They remained in comfortable silence for a few minutes, each immersed in their own thoughts. "I received an interesting invitation today," Thomas eventually said. "Anna is establishing a foundation in memory of Mary Claire in Clear Waters, an educational center for girls, focusing on science and technology." "Mary Claire's dream was to be a doctor, wasn't it?" Augustus remembered. "Exactly. Anna invited me to coordinate the educational program. And did you accept?" Thomas contemplated the city below before answering. "I'm still considering it. It would be a significant new beginning." "What's holding you back?" "For years I ran from Clear Waters, from the memory of my failure, from the guilt. Returning permanently, I don't know if I'm ready." Augustus leaned on the balcony railing. "You know, when I met you here on that rainy night, I saw a man who had lost his purpose. Now I see a man hesitating before a new purpose that intimidates him." Thomas smiled. "Always so direct, Augustus." "It's my charm," the businessman replied, with a smile. "Besides, Clear Waters isn't that far. Helen and I could visit you regularly. We're thinking of establishing a branch of Walker Construction in the region. Sustainable development, renewable energy, that sort of thing." "That sounds suspicious," Thomas teased, "almost as if you had planned everything." Augustus shrugged, an enigmatic smile on his lips. "Let's say that building bridges continues to be my specialty, literally and metaphorically." 2 days later, Thomas returned to Anna's house in Clear Waters. The woman who received him was transformed. not by the absence of pain, which would always be present, but by the presence of a renewed purpose that illuminated her eyes. "So you decided," she said, observing the small suitcase Thomas was carrying. "I decided," he confirmed, "if the invitation is still open." It always was. Anna showed Thomas the plans for the educational center. On a wall, a smiling portrait of Mary Claire occupied a prominent place, not as a memorial of tragedy, but as inspiration for the future. "She would have liked this," Thomas commented, studying the portrait. "She would have loved it," Anna corrected, "and she would have been proud of you, Thomas, of all of us." The next morning, Thomas woke up early and walked to the main church where he had served for so long. Bishop Andrew was waiting for him on the steps as arranged. "Are you sure about this?" the bishop asked when Thomas approached. "Absolutely," he replied. Inside the empty church, bathed in the morning light filtering through the colored stained glass windows, Thomas knelt before the altar. Bishop Andrew gently placed the clerical collar in his hands, not as an imposition, but as an offer. "The church recognizes its mistakes, Thomas, just as you recognized yours," the prelate said softly. "The path back is open, if you so desire." Thomas contemplated the collar for a long moment, feeling its weight not only physical but symbolic. Finally, he looked at the bishop with a serene smile. "I deeply appreciate it, Bishop Andrew. But my path now is different. I will serve in another way with another title, not as Father Thomas, but simply as Professor Thomas." The bishop nodded, understanding. "Faith takes many forms, as does service. Mary Claire would be proud of the man you've become." As he left the church, Thomas felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The weight of guilt, though never completely absent, had transformed into something different, a reminder, no longer a prison. On the horizon, the sun was rising over clear waters, bathing the small town in golden light. A new day was beginning, bringing with it the promise of redemption, not through forgetting, but through the determined action of transforming pain into purpose. Thomas breathed deeply the pure air of the Indiana morning. For the first time in a long time, he felt he was exactly where he should be, doing exactly what he should do. It wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. And this time, he wouldn't walk alone.